So to start with, we're going to solder the on-board components. Those are components that go into the PCB. So the first thing would be the resistors. Each one of these will need bending and inserting into the correct place. So the easiest way to do this is to hold on to the resistor itself and then bend the legs so they sit at 90 degrees to the resistor. That can then be inserted into the PCB. It's a good idea to make sure they go all the way through, so just pull the legs from behind and then on the back, bend the legs to approximately 45 degrees just to stop them falling out again. You'll need to do that for all 4 resistors. Once all 4 resistors are inserted, it is time to get the equipment. You'll need a soldering iron, which will need to be plugged in. You'll need the stand, which has a peg attached to it. This sponge will need to be damp. The PCB can go upside down in the clamp so you can access the solder side of the board. Whilst wearing goggles, you'll need to wipe the soldering iron on the sponge and then just melt a small amount of solder on the end of the soldering iron. This makes sure the iron is hot, but also tins the iron, which means cleaning the end of it. So when you wipe that off, the end of the iron here should be really shiny. Obviously don't touch it because it is extremely hot. Now the actual soldering itself, you'll need to put the iron tip into the joint, which touches the leg and the PCB itself, and then melt some solder on. So we'll see that again close up. Soldering iron touching the pad and the leg of the component. Hold it there for 3 seconds. Feed in the solder. Take the solder away and then take the soldering iron away. Do that for all of the soldering joints. If you get a problem, like I have here, where 2 have joined, it's really easy to fix. Clean the iron and just pull between the 2 joints, and it will separate them out. Once all 4 resistors are soldered in, a pair of wire cutters can be used to cut off the excess legs. If they don't ping off straight away, then just move the wire cutters out of the way and the leg will fall away. It's very important not to pull, because if you pull, you could damage your PCB. The next component is the chip holder. You must make sure that the notch, which will be at one end of the chip holder, is at the same end as the diagram on the PCB. If in doubt, get a friend to check. Put it in place, turn it over, and make sure that all 14 legs are poking through. Once you're happy they are, it is probably going to be easier not to use the peg and just to put it onto the board this time. Again, wipe the soldering iron and then solder each of the 14 legs. This one may be trickier because each leg must be soldered separately. It is really important that 2 legs do not touch. When you think you've finished, have a look at it and check. Are there any holes that you can still see? On my one, I can still see a hole here. So I need to add a little bit more solder. And I can check again. All 14 are now soldered. Again, if two touch, it is very easy to use your soldering iron to heat up and separate them. The next component is the download socket. It's fairly obvious where it goes and which way round, but it is important that all 5 legs fit through the holes. When you've put it in place, push it and it will click. When it's clicked, you know it's in place. Double check that there are 2 legs poking through on each of these large metal pads, and there is one on the large oval pad. This one can then be soldered in place. Again, a wipe on the sponge, holding the soldering iron in place, counting to 3 and feeding in the solder. On these 2 rectangular pads, the solder can touch, and that's the only 2 places on the whole board where it's okay for 2 legs to touch. If there's any gaps, like there is here, just add a little bit more solder. The next component is the terminal block. This is for attaching our input wires to, so that will need to go on the PCB where it says input. Put it with the holes facing outwards so it's easier to insert wires later. You'll need to carefully turn this upside down and put it onto the board to be able to solder it. Again, 2 legs as before. The next component is a transistor. It looks like a black D and has 3 legs. To put it into the PCB, where it says BC548, you'll need to bend the middle leg of the transistor backwards. It's very important that it goes around the right way. When you look from the end, it looks a bit like a black D. The shape on the board looks like a D, just round the other way. So turn it around and make sure that the flat edge lines up with that flat edge drawn on the board. Push it in so there's about ½ centimetre gap to the PCB, and then turn it over and solder it in. Again, if you need to add any extra solder, it's not a problem, but make sure that 2 legs do not touch. As with the resistors, the excess of these legs will need cutting off.